Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Today we're going to take a look at Lord of the Ice Garden from Red Imp Games. Now I have to say something up front as a full disclosure. I received a copy of this game from the publisher with the express reason to review it. And you might notice that the game is on Kickstarter right now. Well, this game has already been published. It was actually on Kickstarter last year, quite a while ago. They published an edition of the game. It was primarily for Europe, but people in the US could back it and receive a copy as well. There were English rules. The version that's on Kickstarter right now is almost exactly the same thing as far as all the components go. However, there was a new cleaned up rule set that was included, and this Kickstarter is primarily for a North American audience. So the version of the game that I have is complete. I played with a slightly updated version of the rules. That's it. Lest anyone think that I'm reviewing a prototype copy, this is a final version of the game. So what is Lord of the Ice Garden? Well, first off, it's based off of a bunch of Polish novels, which I have never read. I'm actually not entirely certain that they're available in English language, but it's a very interesting story. It's like science fantasy. So there is this world called Midgard, like the Norse Midgard, but it's another planet, and scientists from our world travel to that world in order to study it. These 4 scientists, or maybe there's probably more scientists than that, but unfortunately at some point we lost contact with the scientists, and another like special agent from our world named Vuko was sent to try to retrieve them, find out what happened to them, rescue them, and then bring them back. But when he gets there, what he discovers is that on the world of Midgard, magic, at least a scientific version of magic, is a real thing. And the scientists that were sent there became intoxicated by this power, and when he goes to retrieve them, he discovers that they're like these immensely powerful, almost godlike rulers of this world of Midgard. So I believe that the books detail his journey in order to get them back, to bring them to heel because they've become mad with power, and drag them back to Earth for justice, or maybe just kill them outright, who knows. But in this game, you are taking control of those 4 rulers. Each player is going to take, it's up to 4 players, so each player takes control of one of those rulers, and you are trying to dominate this world of Midgard. You're trying to either get as many points as you can by dominating different regions, or keeping your reputation as high as possible, and this like dead snow stuff, like this almost radioactive magical ash, is going to be polluting the world, and if too much of it falls, the game will end prematurely, and whoever has the most reputation at that point is going to be the winner. So you might try to have like a war of attrition and get that to happen and have the most reputation and therefore win that way. But a lot of the times how you're going to win this game is by your individual goal. This is an asymmetrical game in a way because every player has their own individual goal. If you're the, I'm not going to get their names right, but I never remember them. If you're the red faction, she wants to put out these spires or these towers all around the board. She can put out 6 of them, she'll win. Or if you're the black faction, like Van Dyken, he wants to suck up all these magical reserves. So every player can have their individual goal as well as trying to win via victory points or reputation. There's a lot of stuff in this game. I can't give a completely thorough overview of the rules, but let me give you a taste for what it's like. Then we're going to come back and I'll let you know what I think. Okay, I'm going to try to give a very brief overview of Lord of the Ice Garden. I say try because there's a lot of stuff going on in this game. There's a lot of little details. I really can't cover everything, but I just want to give you the gist of what's going on. Okay, so thematically, I went over a lot of the details of the story in my intro, but what you essentially are 4 magical lords who are vying for control of this land of Midgard. And there's 3 different ways that you could potentially win the game. The first, what I would call the traditional way, is victory points. So over here on the side of the board, there's the victory point track, and everyone's going to start off at 0. You'll gain victory points during the course of the game by dominating different areas and taking out enemy units and so forth. If anyone manages to breach the 50 mark on the victory point track, then the game will end at the end of the current rounds, and whoever has the most points at that point is going to be the winner of the game. If you lap the track, you'll just start back at the top, and then the game will end. Whoever has the most points is the winner. You'll also have to score and potentially win via victory points if you reach the end of the initiative track. Now, another way that the game might end is through reputation, or I should say the way that you can win is through reputation. The way that the game might potentially end, and this will come into effect, is from this little spiral here, which is the dead snow track, and this is the reputation track over here. At the beginning of the game, all the players start off at neutral reputation, which can only go down. You'll do things during the course of the game, like using magical powers that are going to make M factor in the game, that are going to make your reputation go down, which has some other really nasty side effects for you, but we'll get to that later. But it's also going to make the dead snow track go up. You're going to move this thing up the track. When it gets to a certain point, depending on the number of players, then the game is going to end, and whoever has the best reputation at that point, in other words, whoever is closest to neutral, is going to be the winner of the game. Now, the final way that the game might end and be won by one of the players is probably the most interesting, and that is if they meet their own individual goal. All 4 potential players in the game, you don't need 4 players to play the game, but if you do use all 4, then they all have different goals that they're trying to meet. Whenever someone meets their individual goal, at the end of that round, they may potentially win the game. If more than one player meets their individual goal, then at the end of the round, whoever has the most points, that's going to be the tiebreaker for that. Okay, so for example, you have Olaf Fuelspin over here, so everyone's going to have their own player board, and here's Olaf's board, just so I can show you what, I'm not going to show you all of them, but just so I can give you an indication of the things that are on here. These are your units and their unit abilities, and then your magic tracker. But what Olaf's special win condition is that he has one of his units, these ice tracars, I believe that they're called, and I'll show you, I should show you as much of these miniatures as I can, because they are pretty impressive. But the ice cars are going to let him steal people's influence cubes, the cubes being the smaller cubes that each player is going to start with in their color. And if he can steal cubes of every one of the other players, he's going to meet his individual goal. Or I'm sorry, he just has to have 6 influence markers of any of the other players, or it can even just be one player. If he can steal that many, he's going to meet his goal. For the red player, Ulrike Freyhoff, one of her units, I think they're called the Enlightened ones, they're going to be able to put out these red spires that will populate around the board, and she wants to put 6 of those out. If she can put 6 of these spires out, then she'll immediately meet her individual goal. The black player is Pier Van Dyken, and actually it's over here. He starts on the board, this magical construct called the Thorn starts in one of the regions. And it can absorb the magical reserve tokens that are on the board, the magical reserve tokens being these things that are populating out on the board. If he can absorb 4 of those, then he is going to meet his individual goal and win the game. And finally, the green player, Passionaria Kahlo, don't you love these names? She's going to try to lock 2 different realms in Nightmare. So she has to first use her Nightmare units here, which are going to place her Nightmare tokens out onto the board, these things here. And when those are out, oh, I'm sorry, it's actually these tokens. And when those are out on the board, she can use another of her units, the Fawn units, in order to, I said Fawn, not the Fawns, to lock down that area in Nightmare, because she's crazy. She's essentially in this eternal sleep or eternal nightmares, and she wants to lock one of these realms in Nightmare. So if she can do that to 2 different areas, she will win the game via her individual goal. Now, there's a lot of extra setup that you need to do at the beginning of the game. As you can see, there's different regions on the game board, and you'll randomly place out these scoring tiles, which do a couple of different things. During certain rounds of the game on the initiative track, you're going to be able to score points depending on who is most dominant here, and that's dominance being determined by influence cubes in a region. But also, you'll be able to get resources depending on who has the most influence here. Influence cubes are what you use to dominate. So whoever has the most influence here would get first pick at getting one of the different resources here. These green tokens being magical factor tokens, then gold, then population tokens. These brown cubes are actually independent forces, and they're just like neutral forces that you need to take out if you want to have a hope of dominating a region. Speaking of that initiative track from before, that's what this area is up here. I hope it shows up okay. It's kind of dark on that area of the board. But there's a few different things going on here. So first off, you see the player markers stacked there. You'll do this randomly at the beginning. But from then on, in player order, players are going to move their initiative markers up the track. They can move once per stage. Each of those sections of helmets there is considered a stage of the game. And remember, I said if it ever gets to the end and that's resolved, then the game can be won. If no one has won by that point, the game will be resolved by victory points. But when a player, it's their turn to, during the initiative phase, which is the first thing you do during your turn, you can move either one or once per stage, you can move up 2 spots on the stage track. Now, the farther up you go, the more actions more action cubes that you're going to get. Those are what the little cubes underneath that mean. However, that also means that you're going to be going further back in the turn order. So that's the kind of balance that you have to strike in this game. Now, these tiles up above the initiative track are actually called Vuko tiles. There's this gentleman named Vuko who is something of a thorn in the sides of these magical overlords, as I explained in my intro. and he's going to be gaining these special abilities whenever it's his turn to act. I'm not going to go into all of them, but they can be very particularly nasty to the other players, including doing things like moving up the dead snow track. So those will be either randomized or placed down with determination, and he may give him permanent or temporary abilities. And the last thing I'll note up there is actually the red ships. The red ships are going to signal a scoring round for you to actually get points from those scoring tiles that I showed you out on the regions. Now, this last section of the board is arguably the most important part of the board, because these are the different actions that you can take during the, or that you first plan and then take. So the way that turn orders go, you go initiative phase, which is the track that I was just showing you, then the planning phase, then the action phase, and the domination phase, which is where you can potentially do scoring and gaining resources and such. Now, you'll notice that there are these red numbers here. Now, these actually come off the board because if you're playing with an advanced version of the game, if you really want to make things a little more strategic and more complicated, then you can actually randomize how these orders are going to be resolved. These the 5 basic actions anyways. I hate to call them basic, but they're like the normal actions that you'll take that everyone's going to be vying for during the course of the round, what you're actually planning for. Otherwise, you can just place them in order, and they'll always be resolved from 0, which is permanently on the board, all the way down to 5. Then there are 2 other actions that happen after those at all times, the 6 and 7. One of them is the attacking, where units will actually battle each other, and then Vuko, this happy gentleman here, who's this is actually his miniature, which will be moving around the board. It starts the board off of the track because everyone has neutral influence now. I'm sorry, neutral reputation, but whenever someone starts dropping in reputation, he'll come out to try to put the smackdown on them. So what's going to happen is players are going to take turns, depending on which area it is, placing their influence markers into these boxes, and then they'll all be resolved during the actual action phase. And I'll just go through all these and give you just a brief look at what they do. So that one there at the top, the 0, is Viper Gorge. And there's actually 2 things that happen here. You can either get resources, exchange resources, or actually, I should say 3 things then, but also the cubes that you put here, and remember you'll be putting cubes into the boxes, you'll put cubes there for the Viper Gorge. At the end of the game, whoever has dominance there, the most cubes, is going to gain extra points if the game is won by victory points or if you need them for a tiebreaker. So it's something you should be considering as you're going through the rest of the game. Now, the number 2 spot here, I don't know why I needed to move the camera that much, is the influence spot. Now, each spot is going to tell you with their icons just a hint of what they do. So what this one is telling you here is that you get to finally, there's a use for those population tokens, which I was showing you before. And the population tokens, you get to spend 1 or 2 of them in order to put 1 or 2 influence cubes out into a region where you already have influence cubes. That's an important part. Now, the next action is the move action. And what the move action is going to do, as you might imagine, now you can spend your gold coins instead of the population tokens in order to move your influence cubes that are already on the board or in different regions to adjacent regions. The regions have to be adjacent. If you're playing with less players, some regions may not be open to you, but they can come from different regions when you're moving them. Now, as sort of a more powerful version of that, Action 3 here is actually the Voracious Mountains. That's going to be like a teleportation. You can take a bunch of influence cubes from one spot and instantly move them into another region, which is sort of a last-ditch thing if you really need to get a bunch of influence into one area at one time. But you do need to spend 2 population tokens in order to do that. Now, the next area, Raven Shadow, is actually a person, a character in these books. And what he's going to let you do is you can spend your level 0 M factor token, which is on the 0 spot of your character tile, in order to do one of 2 things. One thing is that you can move your spot up the reputation track by 2. Remember that this is the reputation track. There it is. So you can never go back above 0 once you're off the yin-yang symbol, but you can move yourself back up in case you're in danger of Vuko attacking you. And that's the other thing that you can do with Raven Shadow there, is that during the course of the game you're going to unfortunately be acquiring these Vuko tokens, which means that you're going to become a likely target and it's going to be nastier for you if you're targeted by Vuko. So using your M factor here is going to allow you to remove one of those tokens. And the last of the spots that you can actually choose during the planning phase and therefore resolve during the action phase is the making spot. This is where, as the name implies, you can either make more units from your particular faction and put them down into regions where you either already have units or where you have influence, or you can choose and upgrade the units that you already have. That's what these tokens that you may have saw at the bottom of the board are. There's different tokens, and they're double-sided, representing different special abilities that you have. So, for instance, speed, which is going to let you quickly move units instantly, almost to make surprise attacks, or domination, which is going to let your units actually count towards your total for domination or give you a boost there. Attacking, which is going to let you spend 2 gold in order to actually attack with units that have that special ability. Or defense, which is going to increase your defense for when people are trying to kill your units, which can be a useful thing. So after all of those resolved, then we get down to 6 or 7, which are the 2 that are permanently fixed. They will always happen after all the other actions are resolved. Now this is essentially the battle phase. This is when all those different units are going to either try to kill each other, move around, and special abilities are activated. So here are the details, everything I kind of just described about spending gold to attack or what defense can probably do, and the speed ability. But also 2 of the factions have special inherent abilities to their units. So for instance, I'm sorry, I'm not getting their names correctly, but Ulreich for, what's her name? Ulreich, that's what it is. If Ulreich, the red player's units that have the Maker Spy ability are in play, then she can actually change up the abilities that her characters have. Basically, they're like chameleons that can change their abilities. So you'll resolve that first. So this tells you the order in which you resolve these actions. And then the Lord of the Ice Garden himself, Olaf, over there, he can actually activate his Ice Drakars and move, as long as he's got at least 2 Ice Drakars on the board, he can move influence cubes between them because they're like essentially Jarl ships. And then my favorite phase, at least thematically, I mean, it does suck if you're gung-ho about winning the game because you don't want to be the focus of his wrath. But when Vuko comes a-calling, there's really no saying no to him. At the start of this phase, Vuko miniature, I should say, is going to move to a region where the player with the worst reputation has the most influence, and then he's going to wreak havoc. The first thing that he's going to do is he's going to kill a unit belonging to that player, and if you have multiple units there, then you get to choose. The person that he visits is going to get one of these Vuko tokens, which is not a fun thing to have. And then if you're playing with the advanced mode and using his special tiles, he may have some other really nasty special ability, like increasing the dead snow track, just as an example. And the last thing that he does, which actually influences the domination phase, which comes after this, is that any player who has Vuko tokens on them, even if it's not the player who was targeted in this round, during the domination phase, in the region where Vuko is, he's going to temporarily capture influence cubes equal to the number of Vuko tokens each player has from that player. So for instance, if the red player has 3 influence cubes in the region that they're currently at, and but has 2 Vuko tokens, he's going to capture 2 of those. And he's going to do that to every player who has cubes in that region who also has Vuko tokens. So it can be pretty nasty. Then you're going to go to the domination phase, which is where players will determine what resources they get based on the resources depicted on those tiles as I was showing you, and you may actually score as well depending on where you are on the initiative track, and that's probably where I'm going to cut it as far as the overview. I know that I skipped a lot of the tiny details about how the combat works and how some of the other things in the game works and how you're putting out your things, but getting your individual goals. But I just want to give you a broad sweeping overview of how the game is going to work and how the flow of it's going to go. You're trying to get, depending on how you think the game might end, you're trying to either get the best reputation and or the most victory points and or complete your own individual goal in order to win the game. And trying to balance all those things is really the key to your success. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. Alright, so first and foremost, I don't think a discussion of this game can be had without talking about the components, which are awesome. I mean, the board looks great. It looks a little busy at first, but then you start to see the detail into the artwork, and it looks really great and all makes sense. The artwork on the character tiles, and then the miniatures are just really amazing and stunning. I mean, I'm not a miniatures connoisseur. Maybe these might only be good as board game miniatures compared to other types of miniatures, but to me they look fantastic, so I really like those, and they're not even painted, the ones that I have. I'm sure the people that have painted them just make them look stunning. So components are knocked out of the park. Really cannot complain about them there. As far as the theme goes, well, like I said in my intro, it's tough because I feel a bit disconnected from it, only in the sense that I haven't read the initial books it was based on. Not that I feel disconnected, but I feel like I'm probably missing out a lot of context. If I had read the books or knew more and more and more about the story, then I'd probably think it was even more amazing. But as it is, I still think it's really good. I appreciate getting into the character and trying to, you know that you're trying to dominate the land, but how every character does that is just completely different. So it's really cool, and every character has different units, so you do feel distinct and different from the other characters, and that lends a lot of theme to the game. So if you're the red faction, it's cool trying to have your devout followers go around the realm and spring up these giant spires, but especially if you're the green character who's trying to plunge realms into nightmare because she's freaking crazy. So that is really cool and thematic. So the game's mechanics, at least as far as the individual goals go, are tightly wound to the theme, and I do appreciate that quite a bit. Now, moving on to the mechanics of the game. This game, it's inevitable. It's going to be compared to a few other games that have come before it or released around the same time of it, that it shares a lot of similarities with. And the ones that immediately spring to mind, I can think of three. And I don't want to spend this whole thing harping on those games, but just to give you an example, Chaos in the Old World, Cthulhu Wars, which was probably in development around the same time as this game, and Game of Thrones. Now, it's similar to Chaos in the Old World and game called Cthulhu Wars because of the asymmetrical faction powers trying to dominate different sections of the land and getting potential victory in different ways. Although it is drastically different than those games in how you use the action allotment, the planning phase, and the actual actions. The different things that you can take on the board are much different than any of those three games that I said, because it's essentially almost a worker placement type thing on top of the area control, on top of the special abilities and unit combat that the other players have. I would say that the game's only similar to Game of Thrones in the sense of having the different factions and trying to dominate and take different areas of the board, although with the addition of the individual goals and the different types of units and what they can do for you, it gets very, very different from that game, but it feels that kind of epic in scope. But yeah, having those different actions that you can take with the planning phase and what each of them do really makes the game feel distinct and not like a lot of different things that I've played before. It's really, and also, I would actually recommend playing with the advanced mode, at least for this part of the game, because having those actions be randomized each round and how they're resolved, not randomized, but I guess you could do it that way, but having players decide in turn order, so you know what you might want to have happen sooner than the other players. That can really be an interesting dynamic to the game. But just having them be resolved in a set order, or even random, I suppose, is interesting as well. Now, the thing that I probably like the most, just at least thematically and tied to the game mechanics, is the whole idea of VUCO. And that is actually similar to another game, BioShock Infinite: The Siege of Columbia, in the sense that there's this sort of neutral force, not neutral, but not on the side of any of the players at the table, who is just running around and wreaking havoc. And all you can try to do is mitigate that by making sure that he either try not to come to you at all, by trying to avoid getting, by keeping your reputation high, or not taking as many VUCO tokens as you can, or if it's going to come to you anyways, you can actually manipulate it in game so that it goes to the area that you want it to. Like, you're like, oh man, okay, he's going to go to the spot where I have the most influence, but if he goes there, he's going to kill one of my really powerful units. So why don't I try and put more influence over in this region this turn, so he'll go there instead. And that might be a region where your opponents who have VUCO tokens have more influence as well, so then it ends up hurting them, which is a beneficial thing. At least it's temporarily taking their influence markers, which could potentially give you an edge. So that whole idea there of planning for VUCO, knowing that he's coming, not really wanting him to, but being prepared to do so, that is very, very interesting to me. It's another cool thematic element of the game. I have played once with the tiles that you can either randomize or put down with purpose that give him special abilities, and that can be pretty brutal at times. But again, I think because anyone has the potential to be hit by that, and because reputation will be going up and down constantly as you go through the game, that can be, it's not as huge of a distinguishing factor. Everyone's potentially going to be screwed by this, so kind of just roll with it. Also, kind of hand in hand with the reputation tracking with VUCO is the dead snow. In fact, one of his tiles can raise the dead snow faster. That's an interesting thing. See, the game, if I was going to say that there's a couple of criticisms of it, first of all, it's very, very non-new user friendly. It's a very heavy game. There's a lot of different things going on. Even though it feels straightforward once you get through it the first time, it's still a heady game with a lot to wrap your mind around. But also, it can go long. The box says between 2 and 3 hours. I'm saying it's probably 3 or more. And so there's these different safeguards in the game to make sure that it's going to end one way or another. If the game is sort of turning into a war of attrition out on the map between players getting their individual goals or putting down their influence cubes, then it might end because of the dead snow track, which I was getting to with the Vuko and Reputation track, because that way it's like this radioactive ash spreading around the countryside and potentially just ending the game prematurely, which is going to force it to go to Reputation. And that's another way that the game is interesting because of these different ways you can win, which is similar to games like Chaos in the Old World. So you have the Reputation track. If the dead snow gets too high, depending on the number of players, that might be the determining factor. If the game gets too far on the initiative track, then the game will end and it's just going to be whoever has the most victory points. Or if someone gets past 50, which, there's always these ways that the game will just end without it dragging on too long. And also, the individual goals can end it rather abruptly if the other players are not keeping you in check. So it's a really interesting dynamic there of trying to balance these different things. And you don't want to neglect victory points too much, because that could also be a tiebreaker. I have seen it where players meet their individual goals in the same rounds, and then it gets down to victory points as well. So you can't neglect any of these different things, and you definitely don't want to neglect your reputation, even if there's no chance that the game is going to end that way. And I could go on and on. There's a lot of interesting aspects to the game. I like all the different units and the different special abilities that they do. The way that battles work, where you have to get the attack special ability and actually pay for it. So it does cost you something to attack. It's just not a total random free-for-all every single round. But it can be very beneficial to you, to your dominance, and you could even do the dominance special ability to give yourself that extra little boost. There's just a lot of things going on in this game. It's very, very interesting. And overall, I like it quite a bit. You just need to be aware that it's a heavy game. It's a long game. But as far as the theme of the game is really, really strong. The game looks beautiful. And while I can't compare it to a bunch of other games as far as individual mechanics, all put together with that action system of putting out cubes, and together with the area control of trying to dominate these different areas, with the asymmetrical player powers and player individual goals, it just comes together into a very unique package, and I definitely was glad I had a chance to give it a shot. That is the Lord of the Ice Garden from Red Imp Games.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.